प्रोग्राम इन द न्यूज़ में आपका खैर मकदम। मैं हूं आपका मेज़बान असद हसन और प्रोड्यूसर है वीटो मीर। और प्रोग्राम के इस हिस्से में हम बात करेंगे यूक्रेन की बहरानी सूरत हाल पे। यूक्रेनी फोर्सेस, आपको सामीन मालूम है कि रूस के हिमायत याफ्ता बागियों के उनकी बगावत का सामना कर रही हैं और वहाँ पे सूरत हाल दिन ब दिन अबतर होती जा रही है। सरहदों पर कशीदगी है और मुआशी सतह पर आम आदमी पर भी दबाव बहुत बढ़ रहा है। यूक्रेन से जो इतलात मिल रही हैं उसके मुताबिक गुज़श्ता साल क्राइमिया की अलहदगी के बाद, जो यूक्रेन के एक इन्वेजन के बाद आप ये कह सकते हैं हुई थी, उसके मुकम्मल सपोर्ट के बाद यूक्रेन में इन्फ्लेशन रेट जो है वो 28.5% बढ़ा है, यानी तकरीबन 30%। और इसके बाद अगरचे वहाँ पे कोशिशें हो रही हैं जंगबंदी की, लेकिन ये जंगबंदी ज़्यादा बहुत सारे मुबसरीन के नज़दीक मुअस्सर साबित नहीं हो रही है। नेटो जो है उसका किरदार पे जब उसकी जानिब देखा जाता है तो वहाँ पे भी बड़ी सी बंदिशें नज़र आती हैं। अमेरिका के कमांडर हैं, आर्मी कमांडर हैं यूरोप के अंदर, जनरल फ्रेडरिक बेन, उन्होंने गुज़श्ता रोज़ एक स्टेटमेंट दिया। उसमें उनका ये कहना था कि जो व्लादिमीर पुतिन है वो नेटो पे बहुत असरअंदाज हो रही हैं और वो उसको तबाह कर सकते हैं, उसको डिस्ट्रॉय कर सकते हैं। ये था उनका स्टेटमेंट। हमने सारे पस मंज़र में एक तफसीली गुफ्तगू की है एडवर्ड जे लेजरिनी से। ये डायरेक्टर हैं साइनर रिसर्च इंस्टीट्यूट फॉर इनर एशियन स्टडीज़ के। इसके अलावा एकेडमिक स्पेशलिस्ट हैं, सेंट्रल यूरेशियन स्टडीज़ डिपार्टमेंट के साथ वाबस्ता हैं। उनके साथ हमने तफसीली इंटरव्यू किया है, उनके साथ हमने इस पर बातचीत की है, वो हम आपको सुनवाते हैं। प्रोफेसर एडवर्ड जे लाज़रीनी, थैंक यू वेरी मच फॉर ज्वाइनिंग वॉइस ऑफ अमेरिका एंड यू आर डायरेक्टर साइनर रिसर्च इंस्टीट्यूट फॉर इनर एशियन स्टडीज़. I would like to talk to you on the Ukraine crisis. The turmoil there is really very sensitive, and this turmoil is going to be the more deepening because the Russian support is going to be more widening for the pro-Russian rebels. How do you see this Ukrainian turmoil and the way international community is taking it?
Well, this has become a terribly complex and difficult situation. Clearly, Mr. Putin's ambitions with regard to Ukraine are deeply at work here, continuing to create a situation that is filled with a lot of potential military action and ongoing crisis. He also has not been very forthcoming over the last few months in terms of discussions with European leaders and the United States as to how some means might be found to draw this crisis down so that the fighting ceases and perhaps certainly Russian troops, whomever they might be, are withdrawn, not only from Ukraine, but back away from the border where they have amassed substantial numbers of troops and equipment, and also have Putin somehow lay better control over the so-called Ukrainian forces that are playing the proxy game for Russia and continuing to cause so much disruption. So the situation is not a good one. It really rests largely, I believe, on Putin's shoulders. His initial...
Right. You are not talking about the rebels, but Ukrainian forces, right?
No, I'm talking about the rebels. That's
right.
What I meant by the... So the rebels who are, we can only presume, are Ukrainian citizens. They may be of Russian background, but they're people who have lived in Ukraine, but who have apparently taken up arms as a kind of rebel force that is, in fact, doing much of Putin's dirty work inside Ukraine.
Last week we saw both the sides, the Ukrainian forces and even the Russia, they were just going back from the borderline. So do you think this ceasefire, which was negotiated by the international community, European leadership, this is going to work?
No, I don't. I think the evidence has already shown that it fell apart almost immediately again. There seems to be, when you look at the eastern part of Ukraine, what you see is the absence of any kind of controlling force. But that, of course, presupposes that Putin and the Russian overlords don't have control over what it is that the local rebels in that part of Ukraine are up to. And I don't believe that for a minute. I mean, if Putin really was interested in a ceasefire, he could put a stop to what the rebel forces were doing, I don't think with too much difficulty. The fact that that's not happening is symptomatic of Putin's behavior. He says one thing, but he really doesn't carry through. He teases with nice, easy answers and accommodations, but in fact, nowhere has he shown a willingness to, in fact, ensure that his agreements or the agreements being made in and around Ukraine are being carried out.
Right. The behavior, the reaction, rather the actions from Vladimir Putin, those are basically the subject of the international leadership. Either they are the political or the military. The U.S. Army commander in Europe, he has shown his concern in a recent interview, and he says Vladimir Putin wants to destroy NATO. Do you agree?
I think he has serious concerns about NATO, or at least he's expressed those concerns on and off over the years, directly or indirectly. He sees NATO as something not as a direct threat to Russian interests, but I think he's at least not happy with the presence of NATO too close to the Russia's natural border as it exists now. But in order to prevent that, it really means that he really wants a buffer zone between Russia and NATO, and hence his efforts to sometimes to stretch into that territory that is outside Russia, belong to Ukraine, or is part of Moldova, or even is part of Estonia, and so forth, where he can find reasons why there either needs to be a Russian presence or the natural Russian presence, because there are Russians living in those places, can somehow be turned to the purposes which he has in mind, which are highly political. So he doesn't really want NATO, I think, too near Russia. I think he'd have a hard time trying to convince too many people that NATO has any aggressive interests in Russia, but it's probably not necessary for him to be concerned. It's a matter of geopolitics. NATO is there. NATO is, of course, its whole history has been, certainly was anti-Soviet, but he tends to see it as a continuation of that spirit, but now focused on ways to keep Russia somehow corralled, somehow caught, stuck in its boundaries, and nothing else beyond that.
So what could stop Russian president for doing what he is doing? So, like, there is one option, like America say it is intended to provide the weapons, even that includes the lethal weapons, to the Ukrainian forces they need. So do you think that could be an effective way to handle Russia and Russians' assertion in that area?
The issue of weapons to the Ukrainians has been a subject of serious debate. For myself, I see no reason. I'm on the side of those who think that the Ukrainians should be given much more support in terms of weapons and whatnot to defend themselves. Again, the situation is not one whereby Ukraine is going to invade Russia. That's obviously not an option here, or in anybody's mind. But they need the weapons to defend themselves. It's a country that's in economic turmoil. Its resource level is limited, and it's going to take a lot to restore Ukraine to a more thriving economic, social, and political society. But in the meantime, it's beset by turmoil within its own frontiers that are military, and which can only be dealt with by the counter-application of military force, which they don't have sufficient.
Yeah, you're right. This political turmoil is turning into the economic turmoil, and it is costing like 30% inflation for the poor Ukrainian.
Right.
So these are the latest data we are having from Ukraine. So again, we come back to the NATO. If the Ukraine, they are not provided the weapons, as many experts suggest, so Ukraine has an agreement that the NATO is basically, the America is providing the safeguards
Right.
needed for the Ukraine in this sort of tension. So what the Ukrainians can do if they are not part of the NATO, as there were the latest effort to
Right.
make it as an associate member of the NATO. Russia is strongly opposing it. So what are the solutions?
Well, they're not easy ones. So you've laid out what the options are, but from a Ukrainian standpoint, I think it's fairly clear that the majority of people in certainly the western part of Ukraine, if not the entirety of it, probably the entirety of it, are more inclined to turn toward Europe. That's where their future really lies, and it's not with Russia. Not that they need to be hostile to Russia, but the level of hostility is going to be determined much less by the Ukrainians than by the Russians themselves and its current leadership, Putin and so forth. I tend to view this with a kind of what the word I want to use is quizzical. It's kind of it's really very strange. Here we have Putin, who, in fact, could earn for himself an enormous amount of goodwill around the world, particularly in the West, if he just behaved in a kind of normal international way. And instead of treating his own country as if it's an outsider and then complaining when other people look at it as if it's an outsider and dangerous, but instead try to accommodate more, try to deal much more with the outside world, and not just the criminal elements in dictatorial societies, but the democracies of Europe and the United States. It would be a very welcome, I could assure him, a very welcome turn of events that would assist Russia in its own development in enormous ways.
Right. I would definitely like to know what could be those ways, because nobody wants the two superpowers, two major powers of the world confronting each other on the state of issues in Ukraine. But the diplomacy at its own is not working. The European nations, they much rely on Russia when it comes to their energy needs. So they are not asserting their pressure on the Russia as well, and Russia is not taking that pressure. Really, the question mark is how the Western countries, other than America, they can play their role.
Well, the Europeans have, to a large degree, put themselves in a box of their own making. They, I think, there was goodwill intended on all this, making these agreements with Russia for natural gas and oil and so forth, thinking that, okay, Russia is going to change. It's not going to be the old Soviet Union. And the levels of hostility are going to diminish, and everything will be fine. But in fact, it hasn't turned out that way. So what you have then is a trap, in a way. It may have been unintended, who knows, but the Europeans find themselves caught now in a situation that forces them to respond very weakly and in limited fashion to Putin's machinations, his maneuvers. And that's very unfortunate, and it's quite... it's a lesson that people need to learn, unfortunately, over and over again. You don't want to become beholding to the place or the society that potentially could be your enemy, because then you're in big trouble. It's like, it's like the Americans. We have this enormous debt being held by the Chinese. That's not a very sound position to be in for this country at all. To this point, it hasn't meant very much, but the potential is always there for hostility to arise and for disagreement to become something significant to the point where that kind of debt becomes a means by which the Chinese can exercise certain kinds of influence.
And when will it be acceptable for the United States and the people of the United States?
Yes, that would not be acceptable. I mean, so I think one of the things that we need to do, just as it gets us off the Ukrainian situation, but in our terms, we need to alleviate that debt. That debt needs to be reduced significantly rather than continuing to increase. But you have the conflict here between economics and politics, and typically economics wins. So it's winning here in our relationship to China. People want to make money. They want to buy Chinese goods because they're less expensive,
Right.
but that increases our debt. The Europeans now find themselves in the same situation vis-a-vis Russia. They do need the oil and the gas, but there are other ways they could acquire that, some of it from the United States. But there doesn't seem to be any interest in alleviating the kind of stranglehold that Russia has over much of Europe in this regard. And until that's alleviated, I think we're not going to see European leaders do
Right.
very much to resist.
Yeah, Professor Lazerrini, I have a very basic question. What is at stake for Russia in Ukraine? Why it is asserting it is not going to acknowledge its role in supporting rebels, but what
Right.
is at stake and what Russia wants to do? Is it reasserting its role? Does it want its extended role in international politics? What?
No, I think that Putin would be happy enough with a Ukrainian government that leaned toward Russia rather than Europe, as seemed to be about to happen a year or so ago before the Maidan episodes and the overthrow of the regime there. So it's not that he wants to bring Ukraine back into Russian territory, but he's leave it independent. But its independence is going to be clearly allied to the interests of the Russian state. And that's the same thing he wants with all the other former parts of the Soviet Union that border on Russia along the south and the west, from Estonia to Latvia and Moldova and so forth. All these places, again, I don't think he's ultimately interested in reacquiring them, but he definitely is interested in seeing in those places a clear tendency to vote with Russia on issues, to be with Russia more than they are with Europe. And the second thing, of course, has to do with Ukraine and Crimea. He wanted Crimea,
Right.
and for lots of reasons. And once he did that, he then has to have access to Crimea. That's a land-based access, and that's what makes eastern Ukraine so important to him. Even if it's just a modest portion of the eastern Ukraine, he would then have direct road travel from Russia through that portion of Ukraine right into Crimea, and he'd have what he wants.
Right.
So
this is the reason it's...
although, if I may interject, it's really kind of
Yeah.
odd, because, and most people don't even know that this is happening, that the Russians actually are building a modern, large naval base to the east of Crimea on Russian territory. They've been doing this for several years, and it's supposed to come online in another year or two. That really makes Sevastopol meaningless.
Yeah, and really it makes it easier for us to understand the issue. Professor Edward Lazerrini, thank you very much for joining Voice of America and being with us in this show.
Okay, I'm glad to chat with you.